virtual roundtable sessions for the series that we're calling Challenges in Digital Assessment, where we're going to bring case studies to the community, to the assessment community that are focused on the new guidelines for technology-based assessment. So I'm John Weiner. I am the current chair of the committee for technology-based assessment that is founded at ATP. And, we were very excited to launch the new guidelines for technology-based assessment towards the end of last year. And it was, I think, a big accomplishment for the many, many authors and technical reviewers and advisors who contributed to this project. And they're listed in this document. Anyway, huge accomplishment, but our work in some ways is just beginning, because now that we have the guidelines, we're really focused now. We've created this committee. We're focused now on promoting awareness and use of the guidelines now that they're here, and then making them more accessible. So, for example, we have translations underway in French and Polish, and we've launched a blog series that's on the ATP website, and we're creating forums for sharing best practices. And this is one of those. So as I said, I'm John Weiner, Chief Science Officer at Lifelong Learner Holdings, and I'm very pleased to be joined by John Kleeman, who is the Vice Chair of the TBA Committee. John?
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Really hope you enjoy this session, get something out of it. Feel free to use the chat to raise questions or comments. We're very pleased to have you here, and we're going to try and put together an excellent session. And this will be a quarterly thing if our feedback is good. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, thank you, John. And so today we have two presenters, and to divide up our time, I'm going to introduce our first presenter now, and that is Erica Laforte, who is a research assistant professor at Northwestern University and also the principal for Applied Measurement Solutions. And Erica is going to talk today about how a project that she led, how the new guidelines played an important role in helping the transition to digital assessment for a clinically administered test. So Erica, if you're there, I'd welcome you to the virtual podium.
Thank you, John. Thank you, both of you, John and John, for inviting me here today. As John mentioned, yes, I work in the clinical psychological testing arena. I have about 25 years of experience developing mostly paper and pencil psychological and educational assessments. So just in the last 5 years or so, I have made my foray into digital applications. And so I'm really excited to be here today and share with everyone my firsthand experience about using the ATP guidelines in the context of clinically administered psychological assessment. So these kinds of assessments are really different in many ways from the more typical multiple choice exam format. But I think it's really a testament to the authors of the guidelines that they're useful across multiple testing programs and in multiple industries. And I think you'll see that highlighted today in the differences between my presentation and Pat's, right? So we both are going to be talking about the same set of guidelines, and we have very different applications for how we've applied them and how we've used them. So again, happy to be here. So just to give everybody an introduction to the test that I'm going to be talking about. For those of you who may not be familiar with individually administered, clinically administered psychological tests. The test that I work on is called the Woodcock-Johnson. It's individually administered, and it measures things like cognitive abilities, oral language skills, academic achievement skills, and it's administered in school and clinical settings. So as these pictures suggest, and if I can point you to the picture on the left here, this is the typical administration of this test. So you have an examiner, or usually a psychologist or a school psychologist, who's a trained professional, and you have one examinee at a time. And those people will sit at a table, and this test book is between them, and the examinee will be looking at their side of the book, and the examiner will be reading the questions and answering questions. The examinee will be responding by pointing and giving oral responses. And so very, very paper pencil based. No, in this picture, you can see the child has headphones on. We do have some audio recorded stimulus material. But generally speaking, it's a very large test kit. You can see in the bottom picture there, those are the materials that are included in the test kit. So it comes in multiple test binders, multiple manuals, lots of paper response booklets and protocol materials. So this test was first published in 1977, and it's currently in its 4th edition. It's normed about once every 10 to 12 years. And it is a standardized norm referenced assessment. We do provide norms for children as young as 3 and adults as old as 100. So it's really applicable for lots of different age ranges. So obviously the bulk of this test kit is really, been something that's been challenging for professionals. And so that was one of the reasons that the publisher had decided that the next edition of the test is going to be delivered in digital format only. And so on the right side of the screen, you can see how we envision this looking in the new digital format. So the examiner is going to be using a laptop and the examinee will be on an iPad. We will still be retaining some paper materials, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But generally speaking, we're taking this very massive test kit to really just a laptop and an iPad. So on the next slide, I just wanted to, I'll cue John to share. Thank you, John. On the next slide, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this idea that the WJ is based on cognitive theory. It's based on a theory of cognitive abilities called CHC theory, or Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory. And so this figure is really just a graphical representation of how the WJ battery measures the narrow and broad abilities under CHC theory. So there are about 50 tests in the battery, and each of those tests measures one or more of these narrow abilities, and the narrow abilities are the things in white, these white boxes. And those narrow abilities wrap up to some broad abilities, and then everything wraps up to, at the very high level, G, or general intelligence. So for example, one of the broad abilities is fluid reasoning. And if a psychologist wanted to evaluate a student's fluid reasoning skills, which is a broad ability, they might administer tests from the WJ that measure things like induction, sequential reasoning, quantitative reasoning, and those things then can wrap up and give us an idea of that child's fluid reasoning skills. So when we first began thinking about what a digital WJ would look like, it was easy to get quickly overwhelmed because unlike tests that are designed originally to be digital or digital native, we're dealing with a test here that has been around for 45 years, and it's built on this idea of CHC theory, and we have a very broad user base who knows what to expect from their scores and who who really are expecting that when they measure inductive reasoning, that it's going to be the same thing as it was in paper pencil. And so we were really faced with this challenge of adapting the tests into a digital format, but really keeping the constructs the same and making sure that we're not introducing sources of variance that might inadvertently change the meaning of our test scores. So next slide, please. And here's where the guidelines come in. So I'm going to be talking a little bit here about the first guideline, and I think it's really meaty, and this is the very first guideline in chapter 1. But I think it's really nice because it allows the user to kind of get a broad picture about, what are all the things you have to think about in a digital adaptation. And so some of those were particularly relevant to our project. I mean, I think all of these are, but the ones that were really particularly relevant were the things having to do with making sure that we're not inadvertently changing what it is we're measuring when we move from paper pencil to digital. And I also wanted to mention that we came across an early draft of these guidelines. These were pre-publication drafts, and they were under review, and it was just perfect timing because we were about to launch our project. And most of us, we have a very talented project team, but most of us didn't have a lot of experience with translating paper pencil materials into digital. And so the timing couldn't have been more perfect. We got a hold of this document, and it was really just kind of serendipitous that it happened when it did, because it allowed us to then, I think, really use this document to help guide some of the design decisions that we made very early on. So on the next slide, I'll just show how we used the information from not only the guidelines from ATP, but the standards from APA and CME, and also WCAG guidelines, which have to do with making sure that digital material is accessible to as wide a range of audience as possible. And so we kind of synthesized what we learned from all of those different documents And we came up with this set of high-level goals and constraints for our project. So on the left here, these are our goals, right? These are the things we want to make sure to achieve in our digital adaptation. And there are things like making sure that we're maintaining the psychometric characteristics of our tests, making sure we're not changing what it is we're measuring. We want it to be engaging. One of the big advantages for this kind of testing in going digital is that it removes a lot of sources for examiner error. Because of the paper pencil version of these tests, we have to rely on the examiner to make sure that they're administering the correct set of items, making sure that they're reading the instructions exactly correctly, making sure that they're scoring things correctly and that they're timing things accurately. And so the digital technology allows us to really remove a lot of the error that might have been present in the paper pencil administration. So those were all advantages and goals that we wanted to consider. But on the flip side, on the right-hand side of the screen here, we have things that, constraints or things that we wanted to avoid, pitfalls or mistakes that, could potentially have a negative impact on our project or on the product. And those are things like, making sure we're not unintentionally altering the construct, changing the difficulty of some items so that some people might be more advantaged by their presentation in a digital mode. Changing the examinee's behavior or the way that they perform, making the test inaccessible to people who might not have as much exposure to computers or to iPads. So really, these guidelines kind of were at a very high level, but at each step in the design process, we're able to go back to them and say, are we achieving our goals, and are we avoiding some of our, potential downsides? So that was, I think we found the guidelines from ATP to be really helpful in helping us put together just these high-level goals and constraints. Okay, so on the next slide, I mentioned earlier that, been mentioning that one of our primary goals is, to really maintain the integrity of the tests and to make sure that we're not unintentionally changing anything. And so one of the ways that we kind of evaluated where those sources of change might come in was by thinking about the way that a test session goes is that we have kind of three players, right? We have the examiner, who's a professional, a psychologist, or a teacher, and we have the examinee, who often is a child but could sometimes be an adult, and then we have the test materials. And so in any test session, we have interactions that are happening, among and between these three different things. And so in thinking about the ways that those different interactions and how those might be impacting, how those might be impacted from going from a paper pencil to a digital administration, we think probably the largest impact is going to be on the interaction between the examiner and the test materials. Because the examiner is no longer going to be interacting with paper materials, and they're no longer going to have to be doing things like flipping to the right page. They're now going to be interacting with a laptop, and they'll be doing things like advancing the screen using a mouse and selecting the correct or incorrect response from a list of possible responses rather than writing the response down on a piece of paper and scoring it. So we think that this experience is going to be really different for the professional examiner. But we don't think that those changes to that interaction are really going to have any, much, if any, impact on how the examinee performs on the test. Those are really things that are transparent to the examinee. Now, we also have an interaction between the examiner and the examinee. And again, we don't see a huge impact here of the move to digital, and that's because in most cases, the examiner is asking questions orally, and the examinee is responding by either doing something, pointing to something, or saying something. And so we don't really think that there's going to be a huge impact or change in the way that happens from the paper test book easel to the examinee looking at an iPad. Where we see a much larger impact or a much larger potential for impact is in the interaction between the examinee and the test materials, because the examinee is now going to be interacting with an iPad. And so before they were looking at a piece, they were looking at a test book, and now they're going to be having to do things on the iPad. And so that's a place where we really see that there could be potentially a lot of change. And so just as an example of that, in the current WJ, there is a processing speed test that requires the examinee look at a series of items on a page, and they have a pencil, and they're asked to cross out the two things in each row that go together, the two words in each row that go together. And so they have multiple pages of this in this workbook, and they have to finish a page and then they flip and go to the next page and keep working, and they're given 3 minutes to do as many as they can. And so in the digital adaptation of the test, we're going to have the examinee be working on an iPad. And so instead of crossing out the things in the row that go together, they're going to be tapping the 2 things in the row that go together. And so there are the potentials that the examinee might not tap hard enough, and so the iPad may not register their tap. Or if the examinee makes a mistake, we have to make sure that they know how to untap or to unselect their answer by tapping it a second time and choose the answer that they want. We have to make sure that they know when they get to the bottom of the page that they have to hit the next button. And so there are all these things that, you know, if they don't go well, or if the examinee is not familiar or comfortable, or, you know, the technology is not working, could potentially impact the examinee's score on that test. So these are just examples of the things that we needed to kind of be careful about and be thinking about in the process of our designing our digital platform. So on the next slide, I just have some examples of how we went from thinking about those interactions and you know, thinking about how do we design this to avoid some of those potential pitfalls. And so we kind of divided them up again in, you know, what are some of the interactions between the examinee and the test materials. And so some of the very early design decisions that we made are, for example, we decided that we don't want the examinee to have to write on the iPad with a stylus. So we decided early on that we were going to maintain paper materials for all of the tests that require the examinee to print or to write written responses. Another design decision we made was that we didn't want the examinee to have to be turning the iPad or to risk having the iPad's stimulus rotate on them. So we are designing only for portrait mode. So there's never a time when the examinee will have to turn the iPad sideways. And again, that was done with thinking that, you know, we don't want to be introducing construct irrelevant sources of variance here by having the examinee have to fiddle with the iPad direction or orientation. Another decision we made was that we wanted to maintain the aspect ratio of the examinee stimulus material. So because this is a norm reference standardized assessment, we don't want people working on larger iPads to be able to see the material bigger than somebody working on a smaller iPad. So we made a design decision early on that the aspect ratio of the size of the stimulus material would change regardless of the aspect ratio of the screen. And so, you know, this is again, that was interesting because it was very contrary to the way that the UI designers think about things. In their world, best practice is to have the material size to be appropriate for the screen. But that's a place where we said, no, you know, this is actually a place where we want to kind of do things a little differently to ensure that we're not unintentionally changing the construct and what it is we're measuring. So I guess, you know, in conclusion, I just want to say that the ATP guidelines really gave us a roadmap of sorts for designing our digital assessment that could capitalize on the benefits of technology while helping us to maintain the construct validity of this very well-known and very established test. And again, it was really comforting for us to come across these guidelines and to have the opportunity to use them even in draft form very early on, because I know, you know, they were written by some of the leading experts in the field. And so I think it kind of gave us assurance that, you know, this document is really a great resource for making sure that people like us who didn't have a lot of experience in adapting a paper pencil test to digital, that there weren't things that we weren't thinking of or didn't know about. So that concludes my my presentation, and I'm really happy to take questions if anybody has any.
Erica, thank you. That was excellent. I'm going to enable the participant screens to have video if people want to ask questions. Turning those back on. We encourage, you know, questions from the audience. I see one from Eric Foley popping up. Were there any challenges in technology availability or infrastructure setup?
That's a great question, and I think what you're referring to is technology availability for the customers, if I'm interpreting that correctly. And so yes, there was a lot of effort put into market research prior to making the decision to go fully digital, because we really needed to make sure that our customers, who are primarily schools at this point, had the infrastructure and the necessary materials to administer the test in digital. And I think what we found was that an overwhelming majority of schools said, yes, we can do this by iPad. We have iPads. Most of the kids in the school have iPads, or at least the classrooms have them available. And as far as internet connection, we've done a lot of work to ensure that the stability of the internet connection doesn't impact the test unnecessarily. So the engineers have designed things so that, for example, a test will download fully before it's launched, so that if there is a little bit of an internet glitch or a little bit of slowdown during an administration of a test, it's not going to impact what's happening on the screen.
Great, thank you. I see we also have a question from Pat. Are you going to be delivering this remotely where the candidate and examiner are in different locations? And if so, what challenges would that bring?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So interestingly, this decision to go fully digital was made right after COVID hit. So it was kind of like we had this plan to do this test again in paper pencil, and all of a sudden COVID hit and everybody was scrambling. The entire testing industry was scrambling to figure out how to do remote testing, right? Especially with kids in schools and needing to legislation requires that testing still happens even when schools were closed. And so we have designed the platform so that it could be eventually used in a digital remote administration. Now, there would be some additional things that would need to be added, like a document camera. But we did make early design decisions with an eye toward someday adding that, as a potential feature.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, and we have one more. I think you did mention WCAG. This question's about accessibility, font size, high contrast, everything in the same size. So what are some considerations there in accessibility?
Yeah. So we worked with a really knowledgeable design firm, and they had intimate knowledge of the WCAG guidelines, and so they helped us to do things like choose fonts. So in our paper pencil testing materials for 45 years, we've always used a serif font, and it was kind of a mind shift for us to switch to a sans serif font, but that was what they recommended for accessibility. Interestingly, in our paper pencil materials, we've always used a blue font for things that the examinee needs to say out loud. And when that exact blue font was translated onto the digital screen, it happens to be almost the exact same blue that people are used to seeing when they click on a link. And so we realized quickly that blue is not going to work for spoken text because people are going to try clicking on it. And so that was, a thing we had to change to a different color for the spoken font. And again, we wanted to make sure that a color was chosen that would be very differentiated, even for people who had, color blindness of different sorts. So yeah, so I can't, I'm not the expert on WCAG, but I do know that the firm we worked with had a lot of really great suggestions and guidelines for us in our design phases.
Yeah, obviously big considerations. One last
Yes.
question I'll ask you before we move on to Pat's presentation. Erica, where are you now in the rollout phase of this project, and can we look forward to another presentation from you down the road with maybe some follow-up data on how things have worked out?
Yes, absolutely. So now we are kind of in the research phases. We've got the platform is built, and we're out there administering it in gathering a lot of data on, not only item difficulty and test difficulty, but looking to see, how the structure of the battery holds. Are we still seeing the same factor structure in digital that we saw in paper pencil? And so there are some, if anybody on the call is currently a WJ user on the Riverside's administration or their scoring platform, if you're a current user of the COG battery, you are able to actually go in and play with some beta versions of the test. So just a little plug for the product there. But yeah, we're hoping, within the next couple of years, we'll have something more to report as far as, how things went and what our data showed us about the digital version. So.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you for sharing your journey with us in this session today.
Thank you again for inviting me.
And so with that, I'm going to invite Pat Ward to begin sharing his presentation.
And just to briefly introduce Pat Ward of Internet Testing Systems, if you're not familiar with him, he's the CEO of ITS, and I was editing the chapter in the guidelines about delivery, and I had the amazing pleasure of editing this fantastic chapter on secure browsers. I thought I knew a lot about secure browsers, but Pat for sure knows more. Over to you, Pat.
All right, thanks, John. I appreciate that. I'm the one who has to bring in the required piece on AI, since it's changing everything. I'm a big fan of some of the things that can be done with AI, but today I'm going to focus on a little bit more of the negative issues related to cheating. So with that said, I'm going to start with just kind of a quick definition of what we're talking about with a lockdown browser. We basically, I did the chapter in chapter 3 of the guidelines, and this is one of the areas that is sort of constantly evolving. And one of the terms you'll hear, instead of a lockdown browser, a secure browser, a secure application. But what it is basically a piece of software that allows the system to add basically a full screen aspect, keep them from basically cheating by accessing other applications, and keep them from basically using software to steal content that is displayed on the screen. So there's some questions that come up, like if you have a low stakes program, you're not really worried about cheating and content theft. Do you need a secure browser? And the answer is basically you might. Using a secure browser, that full screen part does add a usability piece to it. It's a lot nicer. It's a lot better for security, for support. They can't get to other applications easily. So you'll still have a better experience if you do it. If you're in a lab or center network, do you need a lockdown browser? And the answer again is yes. While the remote proctoring world is a lot more challenging, because whenever the candidate or examinee controls the environment, they can do different things. But even in that lab and center environment, you can actually compromise them. And most, if not all of these center networks actually have a lockdown browser as part of their solution today. So that's still part of it. So I'm actually going to start off with a demonstration just to kind of give you an idea of what can be happening out here. As part of this demonstration, I'm going to take an old sample test. We're going to use an older secure browser that we created a couple of years ago, and we're going to demonstrate sort of the use of a hacker application that ITS has created. Now, this application sits in the background. It's, while I call it an application, it's actually sort of running as a process, which means it's sort of activated through hotkeys, and you can do different things while you're on a question. What we have to do to actually do this demonstration is, first of all, we have to record the screen. So that alone is sort of a security violation, the ability to actually copy the screen and store it off. We're then going to use, in this particular demonstration, Windows accessibility APIs that are used to read the content. Now, what I mean by Windows accessibility APIs is there's basically interfaces built into Windows that software like JAWS or NVDA can use to get access to the content and navigate you around the system. We're going to take advantage of that and actually use that to basically get content, but also to answer the questions automatically. Now, if you block these APIs, which is possible, there are other ways to do it. You can take images of the screen and use something like that. We're going to take the content that we grab and we're going to pull it out and then send it over the internet to OpenAI's ChatGPT 4. And then we're going to get a response back, and we're going to use the accessible APIs to automatically answer the question. So as you watch this demonstration, one thing to look at is where the mouse cursor is, because where the mouse cursor is basically not answering the question. So you can kind of see what's happening. It's a relatively simple demo, so you'll get the idea as we're going. So we're going to come into it. And we start with basically seeing it. You'll see we hit a hotkey there, answer the question. This one's a little harder because we got a table in it. And we hit the question. And this one again has another table. So you can see we're going to hit a hotkey and get it. This next question is got multiple frames. So I've got a reading passage on the left, 2 questions on the right. So obviously much harder. ChatGPT 4 did a much better job of being able to answer that last one. ChatGPT 3 was actually getting it wrong most of the time. And here's an essay question where it's got to grab and basically go through not only the question, but figure it all out. And what you'll see is we actually get a relatively nice essay that comes out of it. So the question is, why is generative AI such a game changer for cheating? If you think about what people have to do now, which is, contact some shady people, talk to them, allow them to give access to their computers, there's a lot of people that just won't want to do something like that. But what if you can basically buy a piece of software that other people recommend that sits in the background and hits a key? So in that particular case, it might expand the number of people who might be willing to cheat because it looks like it's easy and painless. I will mention that the people doing this are still opening their machine to people who are not nice people, so it's still not a good idea. But I mentioned earlier, about how ChatGPT 4 was better at answering one of the questions, which in our earlier renditions of this demonstration, it almost always got wrong. Now we're actually seeing it almost always get it right. But we do still see certain kinds of questions that the AI gets wrong in sample tests. So it still is part of it. And I'll talk a little bit about what you can do to get around that. But here is an OpenAI report. So it turns out that OpenAI, who is the people who created ChatGPT, they actually release a study on how OpenAI works and backgrounds. If you want to see this report, just do a Google search for OpenAI technical report. But as part of that, what they did was they take questions representing what you might see on one of these other exams, and then they run it against their ChatGPT 4 to see how many they get it correct. And you'll see the percentiles there are relatively high, right? There's a 90th percentile, 99th percentile. These are, where people are going. So that means they're getting things mostly right. There are certain types of tests that they don't do quite as well on, AP English, language, and composition at the bottom there. But it's something they actually focus on and are actually trying to do a better job with. So the first question I want to answer is, can a lockdown browser actually stop somebody? And the answer that you got to understand is no. Once the candidate and the examinee controls the environment, you can cheat. There's nothing we can do things with. I mean, they can hide a camera in a spot where it's just not picked up, and they can use that to steal content. They can use hardware splitters, and somebody can be in a separate room. Everybody pretty much has two keyboards now, so unless you make them go to the laptop without using their monitor, they have two keyboards, and people can do that. Now, people are working around that, and there's solutions for all these things, but just be aware that it's almost impossible, and you cannot basically stop somebody. But a good secure browser, combined with effective test design, can actually block most AI cheating, if not all of it, and make it much more difficult to cheat and steal content. So the secure browser absolutely matters here, and it's something you want to make sure it's part of your process. So how do you block AI cheating? I mean, what do we have to do to sort of make it happen? Well, the first thing we can do is just block content theft, because the entire process that I showed you meant that they could get access to the content and hit hotkeys to do that. The second thing we could do is block the internet. The internet is sort of a core piece where you're calling out to go to ChatGPT and one of their APIs. Unfortunately, this isn't foolproof, because you can actually install these large language models on your local machine and run it that way. But it actually adds more difficulty to the cheater. It changes things where they can't just install a piece of software. So it does matter. The other thing you can do is basically move content off of the main screen. So actually use artifacts and exhibits tabs where it's separately and they have to sort of tab into it. Make that part of the test. And a lot of tests already have something like this. So they can't get all the information in one big screen grab. So that helps. And if you use images and complex layouts, that can actually help as well, as long as also with advanced item types can actually make a difference in there. So one of the things you need to be aware of is that there's a lot of lockdown browsers out there. And there's actually a shareware one that Microsoft released that's used in a lot of schools. And it pretty much offers no security. So there's really a big difference, I guess, in all the different secure browsers. And there's no real easy way for you to tell whether a secure browser is actually able to stop these things or not, because there's no independent group to effectively test this. So it's very expensive and it's very hard to actually do this. Most secure browsers are actually vulnerable to hacking. And we know this because there's actually videos on the web showing people hacking different secure browsers and different tests. And there's lots of people showing and selling services. I'm going to share just two screens. This one I actually came across this morning. Somebody and my company sent it to me. This is a brand new website called CBT Proxy. And what they do is they basically install some software on your machine and then take the test. So this is old school, not using the AI. They're actually taking the test for you, but they'll give you some information. Here's a Reddit forum that's actually quite useful to go figure out what people are doing. And one of the things you'll find as you go look at what they're doing is that the same people who do like cheating on games is taking that gaming cheating technology and applying it to cheating on tests. So where you're basically bypassing controls that do different things. So one of the questions you might have is it always going to be a problem? In other words, is this going to get better over time? Yeah, I think it is going to always be a problem. That the remote proctoring is not going away. And as long as the examinee controls that environment, it's going to be a challenge. And test design absolutely matters in your process. So what do you want to do? So make sure your vendor is investing in a proven lockdown browser. You want to check the web for advertisements for your specific program if you're not using a service to sort of do that for you. Focus in on test design, larger pools. The answer for larger pools has been, since I ever got into testing, 26 years ago, the answer to, helping in security is larger pools, and that is still true today. Consider whether the advanced item types can make a difference for you, and understand the risk that cheating and content theft when you're using remote proctoring. So you need to know what you're getting into that. So a couple final thoughts on this. How much do you trust your examinees? How big of a problem is that? I work with a high stakes program, and the penalty for cheating for that is pretty much you lose your career in that particular field. That's a lot different than basically being an anonymous person that nobody knows about who's getting an IT certification. So that matters as well. And focus on security. The secure browser and lockdown browser, that's just a layer in your security. So you need to have that layer. And of course, you still need all those other layers, which might include your center and your identification steps, and of course, your test design. So that's it. Thank you. And
thank you, Pat. Great presentation. We've got one question in the chat already, and I'm sure we'll get more. Otherwise, I also have a few questions to ask. But this is a great question from Adam Foley. Have you had any instances with unexpected Microsoft or iOS updates being made to the operating system impacting on browser performance? And if so, how have you managed these?
Well, actually, I'm pretty sure we did actually have problems with this. You'd see it in logs, unexpected sort of interruptions, and you build into your test delivery system the ability to recover and start. So that's just sort of core, but you can block these in a secure browser. So that's the way we actually eventually handled it. So we blocked them from applying an update while we're running, and that's the solution we used.
So another question here is, it seems like human mouse movements, ensuring the mouse is over the button when someone is typing or clicking, and human typing patterns might be key to ensure that a human is answering questions. Comments on that?
Yes. So that's there are some things you can do there. Another problem is, what if they have two mice, right? How do you know that the mouse that's answering it isn't in the other room, right? So you're also worried about that sort of thing. But yes, for the AI piece, you can use the mouse location as part of that to do it. But don't forget that they can basically just mouse over, and it kind of looks like it. So you can kind of at least, choose one of the options. So it's going to be hard for a proctor to pick that up.
And here's another question from Sean Wilson. The suggestions relating to complicated access to the content sounds like it potentially might lead to issues with accessibility, but screen reading tools might also have problems. What would be your thoughts on that?
So we have several programs that use exhibits today, and they all pass accessibility, the protocols and guidelines, whether they're IT tests. We also do some of the English language learning type tests that do this, that have the existing exhibits. But accessibility has to be part of the plan, and as long as they can keyboard around and get to those different tabs appropriately, it'll work fine with JAWS and NVDA as you're going.
And another question, how secure is a native app as a lockdown web browser?
So I think by native app, you're talking about like an iOS app or a Chromebook. So there's actually an interesting answer here because what iOS and Apple did was they built into their operating system the concept of secure assessment, right? So you can put your iPad into a mode which locks it completely down. They've done a wonderful job with that actually, and it works really well. They're the only ones who have done a wonderful job with it. So the iPad, you can pretty much get into a secure model. Chromebook has gone backwards. They used to have ways to do it. You used to have a kiosk mode that you can run. Can't even do it with Chromebooks anymore in an unmanaged Chromebook mode. So that's a real problem. Microsoft has talked about putting in a mode like this, but has never done it. And then the Apple Mac does have a mode like this. So the Apple, again, on the Macintosh has a mode. And that works fine unless you need to access other applications, at which point you have to do it a different way. So there's some sort of a mixed model on this. But yes, that is potentially the future where we can solve some problems.
And then another question from Kathleen, and I think although she's saying she's new to this work, I think this is a question other people would like to answer too. Well, may I ask you for an example of a proactive test design aspect to deter cheating? What kinds of test design things would you want to do to deter cheating?
Well, so, a lot of it comes back to content, multiple forms, scrambling your options, scrambling your order of questions. If you go to a loft type of model or an IRT, or any IRT scored with some sort of selection like loft or adaptive, all of those things can kind of help in the decision. I include item types in the test design as part of it. The more performance-based questions do much better as far as stopping cheating than knowledge-based questions. So things like that matter, the quality of the question, basically. A lot of the traditional issues with cheating and solutions can be applied here as well, right? I mean, AI is just another mechanism, a tool, but the same cheating problem that we've always had is still present.
Thanks. And just in case anybody listening or listening to the recording, so loft is linear on the fly and means that questions vary, and adaptive also means that questions vary based on the previous ones. One question from me, you highlighted the sort of remote proctoring is more risky than test centers, but there have, of course, been incidents of test center proctors being unethical and taking content and things. Is your general view that test centers are more secure, and how much more secure?
Yeah, I have in a certain presentation I do, I actually show sort of a pyramid, top level down of where you can get your best security. Your absolute best security is where your vendor, your provider for center services is actually managing the entire process. That they control the center and they control the proctors, they own it. Then you have your third-party channel networks. That's where it's a training center that sort of does the assessment in a different room. That's sort of another level down from those corporate-owned center networks. You have to sort of put right at the same level as the third-party channel, and maybe even a little better would be like your testing centers inside of a school. That sort of thing would be at that level as well, or your colleges and universities, and we're seeing a lot more of that. You also get a certain level of security when it's a teacher. They're a lot more aware, so that can actually be quite high. And then you go to remote proctoring below almost all of that. And then, of course, remote proctoring is still a level. There's multiple levels in there. You have the human remote proctoring, and then you have your sort of record and review in the back end. So that would be yet one more level. And then, of course, no security at all. If you don't have a proctor involved or a remote proctor, you can pretty much assume your content can be stolen. There's nothing you can do. I mean, there's, even with the lockdown browser, somebody can take, a video of the screen.
Thank you. Any more questions out there for Pat? Could you just drill down on the accessibility thing a little bit? So do secure browsers, are they as accessible as non-secure browsers?
Yes, that's a great question because I in that particular demo, I used the accessibility APIs to steal the content. So how do you do it where you block the accessibility? So this is something that, you know, we just recently sort of started adjusting to in our particular world. You know, because, you know, making JAWS and NVDA and applications like that always available is sort of core to the whole process. So what we're doing is we're switching it to where you can only get JAWS or NVDA, that kind of functionality, if you get pre-approval. So it reduces the window for cheating to only the people who actually have that particular pre-approval for the piece, so that we can at least block it and know it. The next thing you can do is try to detect that it's actually being used. So there's some things we can do there. So from an accessibility perspective, it might add some process to the whole thing, but no, the secure browsers are absolutely accessible, and they're a core part of it. In fact, they make it sometimes a little bit easier to do accessibility because you don't have to worry about all the UI in a regular browser. It's just the application of the assessment itself. So it's better for, I think, an accessibility perspective.
And thank you. And one more question. What about updates? How often do you think a secure browser needs to be updated?
Oh, we update our secure browser, the one that we do. It's at least quarterly, and it can be, you know, even monthly at times. So it's one of those. This is an area that you are constantly evolving and adding and functionality to. And you have to remember, I mentioned all those platforms. Every one of them is kind of a distinct, you know, secure browser. You have the Windows, the Mac, the Chromebook, the iPad. So each one has its own challenges.
I think that's really helpful. Thank you very much indeed for sharing your expertise. So we, in a moment, John Weiner is just going to wrap up. But does anybody have any more? Does anybody have any general comments? Would feel free to make them in the chat. Also, we'd love to hear of potential challenges that people have, or what you'd like to see in future technology-based roundtables. So, is there an area of technology that is interesting, troubling, challenging?
Yeah, good questions, John. And thanks to both Pat and Erica. You know, during this last phase, I think in our final 10 minutes, we'd like to really open it up to a more general conversation. If you do have any other questions for Erica or for Pat, we can have additional conversation about that. So first I'd ask or invite discussion there. All the video cameras are enabled, so people are welcome to come on up to the virtual podium or the virtual roundtable and join the conversation. Yeah, going once. Okay. Well, I'd like to follow up on your question, John, which is, where are people who are here today? Where are you experiencing challenges right now with the use of technology in assessment? What kind of challenges are you facing? And what are some of the hot points for you, hot button items that the guidelines might be helpful with? Any thoughts?
Also, feel free to let us know after the session or privately if you want. You might not want to say it, but let John or me or Pat or Erica, feel free to reach out to us after the event.
For sure. And a couple comments I would make, maybe this will stimulate something, is Pat's presentation was wonderful, focusing mostly on delivery and secure browsers. The guidelines do have an entire chapter that is also on security, authored by David Foster and Rachel Schoenig, and it's which has further discussion of security concerns, threats, risks, and so forth, and then guidelines for putting a security plan together, things like that. So I
John,
think you'd find that interesting.
So Adam Foley has put his hand up. He'd like to say something, and Craig has also asked a question.
Okay. I'll be quiet. Go ahead.
Adam, go ahead.
Thank you so much, and thank you both for really interesting and thought-provoking presentations. A question that for Erica primarily, really, you know, you've obviously been developing your product and you've created something which is now fit for your market, fit for purpose. But how will you continue to innovate? And the question that, well, the point that you raised earlier about the fact that you've got certain aspects of your provision which are still paper-based, which again I think makes perfect sense in the illustration that you gave. But are you thinking about further innovation and what comes not just on the back of that, but what the future of your product will look like as well, and how are you going to tackle some of those challenges?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Actually, I think we're looking at it not so much as a challenge, but as sort of a door opening, right? Because in the paper pencil format, there are some serious limitations to certain kinds of constructs being measured. And I'm thinking about things that require more precise timing. And so there are a lot of abilities, human abilities that have to do with how fast you can do something. And so we're discovering that moving to digital is giving us the opportunity to maybe add some constructs to our battery that we weren't able to really measure either well or precisely enough in paper. So I think, now the road that we're going down is innovating in terms of what can we do now that we couldn't do in paper? What are the opportunities we have to add, different kinds of ability measures that weren't really feasible in paper. So, yeah, I think we're looking at it more as as an opportunity rather than a challenge.
Thank you.
Good.
And I think Craig's comment here is probably not a question for now, but saying that it'd be interesting in the future to have an explanation of WCAG design in the future. Thank you, Craig.
Yeah, that's correct. I hear a lot of talk about accessibility, and I don't hear a lot of explanation about accessible design. And I think many of us could benefit from learning more about that.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion, for sure, Craig. I will, not to be the guy who points out everything's in the guidelines, but there's a very, I'll just take that as an opportunity to say in the first chapter of the guidelines, there's a very nice discussion of universal design principles as applied to test design with using technology, and with the concept of removing barriers and the concept of inclusiveness in assessment. So I think that's probably related, Craig, but I think that would be a good session. So we'll take note.
Thanks.
I'm admitting someone to. Yeah.
So John,
Go
I
ahead,
think
John.
if you want to take us through to just the final slide or two.
Absolutely. So a couple of things. One is, for those of you who haven't really seen the guidelines, and you might be asking, how do you get a copy? They're available at no charge in soft copy from ATP's website, also ITC, but since this is an ATP session, we'll just give you the ATP link here. It's also available as a book, a printed book through Amazon at a modest fee. And it's especially nice to have on your shelf. It's a nice compliment. There's a couple things we're doing with the committee that we're focusing on this year. One is we're developing case studies. This is part of the awareness, adoption, and use initiative that we have underway. And so we'd be interested if any of you are a testing organization or work with testing organizations that would like to work with us to develop use cases, sort of like what you saw today. A couple of interesting use cases, application of the guidelines in the real world. We'd love to have you. We'd love to talk to you about that and explore how to go about that. So that's a real area of focus for us. There are other areas to get involved in the TBA committee, and you can reach out to myself or John Kleeman. My email is wrong there. There's only one N in Lifelong Learner, but myself or John Kleeman, we'd be more than happy to chat with you about, how to get involved. So, yeah, thank you all for being a part of our inaugural roundtable series. We hope to have many more of these. Again, Pat, Erica, great sessions today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Cheers.